What's up? This is your girl T. As a black woman in her 30s, I'm constantly trying to figure out life. But the one time of the week where it all seems to come together is on Sundays. Yeah, that's right. When I talk with my girls at brunch over a glass of champagne. I created this podcast to bring good vibes and open dialogue about various topics from mental health, relationships, personal development, the workspace, to the bubbly that happened over the weekend. Sundays are a time for celebration, rest, and reflection. So welcome to Champagne Sunday. Grab a glass, pop a bottle, and get ready to pour it up. Champagne Sunday is pleased to provide you with social media content for your personal education and informational purposes. Reliance on any information provided by Champagne Sunday or by any person or professional appearing on this podcast is solely at your own risk. Hey, welcome back to Champagne Sunday. It's your girl T, and I am so glad you were able to join me for another episode of Champagne Sunday. Today, it's looking pretty good because I am sipping on a glass of champagne. Yes, this is coming from the Bel Air collection from Rick Ross. This is called the Rare Luxe in the white bottle, and it is so smooth and so bubbly and so good. Yes, so you definitely have to try it. And today I felt like putting a little juice in my champagne. So yeah, I'm sipping on a mimosa. And so, what other way is there to have champagne than to put a little bit of OJ? Sometimes I do put a little pineapple, just to spice it up a little bit. But that's what I am sipping on today. Today, I really wanted to get into talking a little bit about grief, right? Because honestly, I feel like my life has been surrounded by grief in these past probably couple of months. And not only that, I see that there's a lot of grief going around with other people too. Just like I see things posted on the internet. Grief is always, people are always passing. And I think grief is a natural part of life, whether you're grieving a person or grieving a loss of an opportunity. We usually see that grief is in our lives in some way or another. And I just feel like lately grief has really been ingrained in my life or just kind of been there and very noticeable where it's hard for me to ignore it or avoid. And so I wanted to spend this episode talking about grief and just my experience so far with grief and how I'm able to cope. And maybe this will give you some, some suggestions or some hope in how you can cope with grief too. So we always start off our episode with a bubbly. And a bubbly is just a positive affirmation. It also can be a quote or something that can help us get through the day or lift ourselves up. And it also is usually related to the topic of Champagne Sunday. And so since the topic today is going to be about grief, the quote goes as follows. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So I really wanted to focus on that quote because, again, lately grief, I just feel like I've been surrounded by grief in my life. And the quote goes on to say that the fact that grief is, you're immersed in grief or it's around you, it's hard not to be impacted by it. It's kind of like if you were in water and you thought that you weren't going to get wet. It's just inevitable. Like it's going to happen, right? You're going to be impacted by grief in some way or another. And so I think that this is also important because a lot of times people, when we talk about grief, people often talk about or think like, how long do I have to go through this suffering? A lot of times people are trying to come out of the suffering, come out of the situation. And I think it's important to know that in grief, you don't really move on. You don't move on from grief and say, okay, I'm in a new place. I have a new life. I'm not thinking about that anymore. I think people who have lost a person, especially, or a loved one, never really go and say, I've moved on from that person or I moved on, but rather that you move forward from grief. You move forward. And so that person is always with you. You always think about that, but you're able to carry that person with you in new endeavors in life and do new things. And I think that you may be in a good place in life, but the moments of that person are the lost opportunity will always and forever be with you. And so I think that's a good way to look at grief is moving forward. We're not moving on from it, but we're going to move forward with from grief. We're going to move forward from it. And and thinking about grief, a lot of times people always go, okay, there's the 5 stages of grief, right? So usually the 5 stages of grief is denial, thinking that this can't happen, anger. You might also start bargaining with God. You might experience some depression, and then you might eventually, they say, you get to acceptance. The real when it comes to grief is that it's no real linear path. Like some people may experience some of those stages of grief, and some people may not ever experience any of those grief stages. And if you do, it doesn't mean that it's going to be in the exact same order, right? It doesn't have to be in the sequential order that you experience it. You might hop around, or you may never experience that. The fact of the matter is that everybody experiences grief differently. And for me, I take it that my personality, I usually, when it comes to dealing with grief and when it's surrounded by me. So recently, kind of going into a personal note, grief has been surrounding me because my aunt, which is my mother's sister, recently passed. And then right now we're preparing also for a loss, which is my mother's brother. So it's really close. So I'm really close to my mom. So my mom is, going through it and struggling in a sense of like, I guess, struggling in the sense of that she's coping and grieving and going through her own process, but also being really close to her is that it's inevitable for me, is it inevitable for me not to also feel, not only because I have a connection with my aunt and my uncle, but also because I have a connection to my mom, to see her pain, it also hurts me. So thinking about grief and then also to my other family members too. So I think it all just, seeing the family just go through an experience of this, and then seeing yourself, it's just a lot to take in, right? So you have your grief that you're dealing with. You may have other family members that you're kind of concerned about and worried about too. So it's just a lot to all take in. And so for me, being away from North Carolina, so all my family is mostly in North Carolina and South Carolina that is related to these immediate situations. So I'm away from all of that. So I'm here. So when I'm thinking about dealing with grief and dealing with my emotions, it's easy for me to kind of avoid and not really think a lot about it because I'm away from the situation. So I may handle or cope by kind of engaging more in my work, or kind of doing more work, or hanging out with friends, or a lot of, it's easy to avoid or not think about it. And so a lot of times it's a privilege, I think, to not have to be there every day, that I can kind of still be able to live my life and then also maybe go on the weekend and kind of be immersed in that as well. So when you think about grief, everyone deals with the grief different ways. Some people may, you know, attach themselves to others and want to feel connection. Other people may withdraw and want to be isolated and by themselves. Other people may seek prayer. Other people may go to rituals like cooking and memories and doing things of that nature. But everyone has a different way of how they grieve, and no way is right or wrong. And so a lot of times people will say, "Oh, you're being very strong," but even if that person wasn't strong in this moment, it's not necessarily wrong or right. Like you can be strong, you can be weak, you can cry, you cannot cry. Sometimes I think a person with anxiety or someone who thinks a lot about others' perspectives may feel like, oh, I'm not grieving in the right way, or I'm not acting or behaving in the right way. But again, there's no right or wrong way when it comes to grief. It's only, again, the way that you perceive it, or the way that you're actually going through those emotions. Grief can be, again, influenced by personality, your coping style, your life experience, your faith, and even the nature of the loss. It all just depends on that person. And again, thinking about healing happens gradually over time. It can't be rushed. I think the hardest part for me with grief and dealing with just the amount of emotion is having compassion fatigue. And I recently put a post on my Instagram about compassion fatigue. And it's just the fact that you are starting to feel depleted in your emotional cup to be able to feel empathy and sympathy for others and to be able to really show emotion or kind of be there or help others. You're starting to feel depleted or the lack of ability to do so. And so I think as a person who is a psychologist in the family, a lot of people will come to me and ask me questions about things that they're going through or seek advice through me. And it is an honor and, again, a privilege to be able to help those, to be able to offer mental health advice, to be able to offer comfort to my loved ones, my families, my friends. However, sometimes that becomes very daunting and it starts to take away from you. It starts to feel exhausting and mentally fatiguing, especially when there is a lot going on. So take for instance if we think about COVID in 2020 when everybody was kind of going through a grief in some way, whether they lost the opportunity, lost the chance to hang out with friends, or loss of routine, loss of a person. Everyone was dealing with grief. And so if you are a person, and you don't even have to be a psychologist, honestly, if you are the person in your friend group or in your circle or even in your family that people always go to for advice, they always seek advice from you, or you're always the one or the first person that people look to receive help, then you may feel compassion fatigue, that you may have this inability or feeling that you can no longer help, or like it is just too much. So with compassion fatigue, you may feel irritable, you may feel, again, fatigued or tired, you might have heightened anxiety, again, the reduced ability to feel empathy and sympathy, impaired ability to make decisions and care for others, limited tolerance for stress. You may start dwelling on the suffering of others, and also have limited concentration. And I honestly didn't realize what it was. So, like, I know what compassion fatigue is. Like, my coworker brought it to my attention maybe some years ago, or maybe right around 2020. And I thought it was an interesting concept, and I didn't really think much of it. I just thought that it was very necessary to talk about at the time because we were giving different presentations to childcare workers who were experiencing compassion fatigue. And so I didn't really apply it to myself, but it wasn't until I was in a meeting with the same coworker, and she was talking about compassion fatigue once again in our supervision, and it dawned on me that that was what I was experiencing because it had been prior week. I had received a phone call from my sister, and she was very stressed and upset and very emotional, and I wanted to be able to lend a ear and be and comfort her and say the right things and give her suggestions and advice. But I just found myself stuck. I found myself that I couldn't really give that advice. I didn't know what to do, what to say. And even though it wasn't like I said anything mean, I just kind of I feel like I gave her the bare minimum. And then later, after I took a break, kind of relaxed and was able to, take a breather, I was able to give her a little more. But I didn't realize until I was in that supervision meeting that, oh, T, you was experiencing compassion fatigue. It was impacting you physically and mentally, helping others. Like you were actually feeling drained and that you couldn't bear it. And it also was this weird feeling of where that's why I said stuck, because I wanted to help. I wanted to reach out and do more, but I just felt like I really didn't have anything left to give. So, as we always say on Champagne Sunday, pouring into yourself so you can pour into others, and making sure you're pouring into yourself where the things that you pour into others isn't necessarily coming from your cup, but it's coming from the overflow. It's coming from those things, the so much the self care and the whether it's self care routines or other things or hobbies or whatever you pour into yourself for that day or that week, that it becomes so full that it starts to overflow that you can also pour into others. But if you are not pouring into your cup, you'll probably start to feel compassion fatigue like I did, where I just didn't feel like I could give, even though I wanted to. So I speak that or talk about compassion fatigue because when you're going through a lot of people in your family are going through grief and you're the person to help or to give advice, it can feel overwhelming and overbearing to have to feel like you are handling your own emotions, but also the emotions of others. So it's really important to look out for that. And you can combat compassion fatigue by, again, engaging in self care routines and also just taking the time to be mindful, to just sit still. And if that means setting boundaries too. So if you need to tell someone no or tell people that you can't do it, it just means setting boundaries. And we can go into setting boundaries another day a little more in detail, but that is setting boundaries is also a part of self care. So, a little bit going back to grief, I just want to say that when it comes to grief, I want to make sure that people understand that validating emotions is very important. And how you validate emotions can be just as essential, right? So a lot of times people offer condolences and support when people are going through grief, but it's important to know how you're doing it. So when I say that, I mean specifically if you are, offering support, not asking someone how can I support you. Clearly this person may be, again, going through compassion fatigue, may be unable to really process or think for themselves. So being specific and offering suggestions to help that person is better than just asking how can I help. Another thing too is allowing people to process their emotions in whatever way that is. So not saying, "Oh, you need to be tough," or "You need to be strong for this," or "You can get through this." Not putting unrealistic expectations are, and I say unrealistic because maybe that's not how that person copes, right? Telling that person not to worry. Of course, that person is going to worry. It's natural for them to worry. Um, Changing it to yourself, saying, "Oh, the same thing happened to me. Let me tell you." Instead, say something like, "Wow, that sounds tough. I can go and get you this thing." Or sometimes it is, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Sometimes it is okay to ask people what you need right now, but you have to measure it out, right? You have to read the room and see if it is where you should just go ahead and take initiative, or you might need to ask to see how you can support that person. Telling someone that they can cry as much as they need to because this is painful. Validating whatever feeling it is. If they're confused, saying, it's okay to feel confused. I understand why you may feel confused now that you've told me that or that you've explained that way. Really validating and just affirming people's feelings. Not saying you'll be all right. This too shall pass. Black people love saying this too shall pass. At least you had blank, blank, blank time together. No, validate their feelings by saying, "I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I will be here for you to help however I can." You know? So that is ways that you can support people in validating their feelings and sending condolences. So I think the last thing, this is going to be brief. I don't want this to be too long, but we talked again about loss and grief can be in different ways, and everybody can grieve in um, at different times. Knowing that the loss can be different types, so you can lose a loved one, you can be loss of your health, loss of a job, loss in trust of authorities. We saw that a lot in 2020 with the police system, loss of a sense of security, loss of a sense of freedom, loss of opportunities, loss of social interactions, also in 2020, and loss of irreplaceable experiences, large and small, which again, 2020, we saw that. But that can also continue throughout because now we're 2 years out from COVID-19 when it first came, and we are still experiencing loss and grief. So, the end note, I just want to say, in order to pour in yourself with others, know that you can do different things to cope with grief. And sometimes your grief can maybe become complicated where you might need to seek mental health services if you're feeling like that you're always thinking about it. And again, there's no timeline on coping or kind of, again, if people are trying to move on from grief, but again, we're trying to move forward. There's no timeline of how long you will grieve. But if you find yourself just not being able, having a loss of interest in activities, maybe feeling overly irritable, searching maybe for your loved one, just having this intense longing and yearning for your decreased loved one, and finding that even over time things aren't getting even a little bit better, like things aren't even getting better, then you may need to seek professional help and support. And so, in order to pour in yourself, if you are experiencing grief, I want you to make sure that you're turning to your loved ones and getting support through friends and family members. Draw comfort from your faith. And also, if you need to, if you can't relate to those in your family, even though sometimes we all are experiencing the same things, it can still feel lonely. Maybe joining a support group or someone, a professional group that can maybe relate to your specific loss. Take care of yourself. Make sure you're facing your feelings and express your feelings in a tangible or creative way. Engage in mindfulness and relaxation. Engage in favorite activities. Look after your physical health, so work out. And also prepare for triggers. If you know that the anniversary of a death is coming up, or if you know that something reminds you of that person, prepare yourself for those triggers, so that you are better able to cope. Also, engaging in rituals, whether it's memorials or candlelight visuals, or preparing something for your loved one, or kind of doing a special meal, or all those other things can also help with coping with grief. So, kind of developing alternative rituals. So, finding an outlet for your sadness, cooking the deceased person's favorite meal, and talking or thinking about how you love that person, finding safe ways to resume or stimulate fun activities. All of these things are important when thinking about grief. So thank you again for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I hope that this again may have helped someone, because I'm definitely going through my own process, and I hope that this gives you some reassurance that there's no right way or wrong way to grieve. It's all about like what you're feeling, how you feel, and that you process it at your own pace. And that even if you feel withdrawn, or if you don't feel withdrawn, you feel like you want to be connected with others, each one is your personal way of dealing with it, and it's not right or wrong. So thank you again for tuning in to Champagne Sunday. I hope that you had a great Sunday, and cheers. Cheers to moving forward.